The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tennis courts of Palm Valley Country Club, where James worked as a personal trainer. At 32, he turned heads wherever he went. His perfectly maintained physique, bright smile, and charming personality made him popular among the club members. But behind that perfect smile lay a mountain of debt and a desperate plan. He first noticed Mrs. Richardson during her regular morning workout sessions. She was in her mid-60s, always dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than his monthly salary. Her fingers sparkled with diamonds, and she drove a brand-new Mercedes S-Class that she casually mentioned was her around-town car. The real beauties, she'd said with a laugh, were kept in her garage at home. Life hadn't been kind to James lately. His smoothie bar business had failed miserably, leaving him with crushing debt that kept him awake at night. His credit cards were maxed out, and the loan sharks were starting to send threatening messages. Every time he checked his bank account, his stomach turned. He needed a way out, and fast. Mrs. Richardson, or Diana as she preferred to be called, was different from the other wealthy members. While most elderly patrons barely acknowledged the staff, she always had a kind word and a genuine smile for everyone. She'd lost her husband 3 years ago to a heart attack, and James could see the loneliness in her eyes despite her cheerful demeanor. During her workout sessions, she would share stories about her travels: Paris in the spring, winters in the Swiss Alps, summers at her beach house in the Hamptons. James found himself listening with genuine interest, imagining what such a life would be like. He noticed how her eyes lit up when someone took the time to really listen to her stories. The more he observed her, the more he realized she was the answer to all his problems. She was wealthy, not just country club wealthy, but seriously rich. Her late husband had been a real estate mogul who'd left her everything. She was lonely, kind-hearted, and, most importantly, seemed to enjoy his company. At first, James told himself he was just being friendly when he started paying extra attention to her workouts. He'd adjust her form during exercises, spend extra time designing her fitness program, and always make sure he was available during her sessions. He learned her schedule by heart. Mondays and Wednesdays were for personal training, Tuesdays for tennis, Thursdays for spa treatments, and Fridays for lunch with her friends at the club. The plan formed slowly in his mind. It wasn't hard to figure out that she was worth millions, probably tens of millions. Even a small fraction of that would be enough to solve all his problems. He just needed to play his cards right. When she mentioned having trouble with her home gym equipment one day, James immediately offered to come by and take a look. It was his first glimpse of her world. A sprawling mansion in the most exclusive part of town, with manicured gardens and a view that took his breath away. The house was filled with priceless art and antiques, but what struck him most was how empty it felt. Family photos lined the walls, but the huge house echoed with loneliness. That evening, as James drove home to his cramped apartment, he couldn't stop thinking about the opportunity in front of him. Yes, there was a significant age gap, but he'd seen bigger age differences in relationships. She was still attractive for her age, kept herself fit, and had a great personality. He could do worse, he told himself, much worse. He began dropping subtle hints about his own loneliness, crafting a story about how his last relationship ended because his ex couldn't understand his dedication to his work. He made sure to mention his love for classical music, after noticing her extensive collection, and his interest in art, after seeing her gallery-worthy collection. Each detail was carefully chosen, each story perfectly crafted to create a connection. The other trainers at the club noticed his special attention to Diana and started teasing him about it. He laughed it off, playing the role of the dedicated trainer who simply cared about his client's progress. But inside, he was carefully calculating every move, like a chess player thinking several steps ahead. As the weeks passed, James could see his plan working. Diana's face would light up when she saw him, and she started scheduling extra sessions. She began sharing more personal stories, her fears about growing old alone, her children who were too busy with their own lives to visit often, her dreams of traveling the world again but not wanting to go alone. James knew he was playing a dangerous game. If anyone figured out his true intentions, his reputation would be ruined. But when he looked at his mounting bills and thought about the life he could have, he pushed his doubts aside. After all, he told himself, he would make her happy. She would have companionship, and he would have financial security. It was a win-win situation, wasn't it? Little did he know that his perfect plan was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Over the next few months, James orchestrated what looked like a perfect chance romance. Each morning, he'd arrive at the club early, just to catch Diana during her regular workout sessions. His attention to detail was remarkable. He noticed how she liked her towels folded, remembered exactly how she took her morning tea, and always had everything prepared before she arrived. "You're so thoughtful," she'd say, touched by his small gestures. "Nobody pays attention to these little things anymore." Her eyes would sparkle with appreciation, making James feel a twinge of something. Was it guilt? He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on his next move. The club's other members couldn't help but notice their growing closeness. Some of the elderly ladies would whisper behind their tennis rackets, watching as James spent extra time adjusting Diana's posture during workouts. The younger trainers rolled their eyes when he volunteered to cover Diana's sessions, even on his days off. "My dear," one of Diana's friends, Mrs. Chen, warned her during their weekly bridge game, "don't you think he's a bit young to be so attentive?" But Diana just smiled, enjoying the attention that made her feel alive again after years of loneliness. James played his role perfectly. He casually mentioned his love for old movies when he overheard Diana talking about classic films. During their training sessions, he'd share carefully crafted stories about his childhood, about growing up with a single mother who taught him to appreciate strong, independent women. Each story was designed to create a connection, to make her see him as more than just a trainer. One rainy afternoon, when the club was nearly empty, Diana opened up about her late husband. "Thomas was always busy building his empire," she said, her voice soft with memory. "I understood, of course. But sometimes I felt like a beautiful piece of furniture in our home, admired but not really seen." James listened intently, his hand resting sympathetically on her shoulder, while his mind calculated the value of the tennis bracelet on her wrist. He started creating seemingly spontaneous encounters outside the club. He'd accidentally run into her at her favorite coffee shop, having memorized her Saturday morning routine. "What a lovely surprise!" he'd exclaim, knowing exactly when she'd be there. These chance meetings always led to long conversations where he'd hang on her every word, building her trust one carefully planned interaction at a time. Diana's children, both successful professionals living in different states, began to notice the change in their mother's behavior. She talked about James in every phone call, mentioning his kindness, his understanding nature, his maturity beyond his years. Her daughter suggested flying home for a visit, concerned about this sudden friendship, but Diana assured her everything was fine. "He reminds me of your father when we first met," she told her skeptical daughter. That same drive, that determination to succeed. Of course, she didn't mention the 40-year age gap that was becoming less and less important to her with each passing day. James kept his financial troubles carefully hidden, presenting himself as someone who chose to live modestly because of his values, not his circumstances. When Diana mentioned her favorite restaurant, an exclusive place downtown, he'd smile regretfully and say he preferred cooking at home. "It's more personal that way." This usually led to her inviting him to dinner at her house, exactly as he planned. During these dinners, he'd admire her art collection with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he'd done his research. He learned about her favorite painters, studied wine to be able to discuss her collection intelligently, and always brought small, thoughtful gifts, nothing expensive enough to raise suspicion, but personal enough to show he cared. The staff at the country club started taking bets on how long it would take for their relationship to become official. The younger employees thought it was weird, but the older staff members defended Diana. "She deserves some happiness," they'd say, though they too had their doubts about James's intentions. One evening, as they sat on her terrace watching the sunset, Diana touched James's hand gently. "You know," she said, "I never expected to feel this way again at my age." James squeezed her hand in response, ignoring the text message vibrating in his pocket, probably another warning from his creditors. He was getting closer to his goal, but sometimes, in quiet moments like these, James felt the weight of his deception. Diana's genuine affection, her complete trust in him, made his carefully constructed plan feel suddenly complicated. But then he'd remember his debts, the threatening messages, the desperate need for a way out, and he'd strengthen his resolve. What he didn't realize was that while he was studying Diana, Others were watching him. The security guard who noticed him googling Diana's late husband's net worth on his phone during breaks. The observant bartender who saw him tense up when Diana mentions setting up a prenup like she had with her first husband. Small details that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later become very important. As autumn turned to winter, James knew he was reaching a crucial point in his plan. He needed to move things forward before someone got suspicious, but he also had to be careful not to rush and make mistakes. Little did he know that his perfectly orchestrated pursuit was about to face its first real test. Despite the whispers and raised eyebrows at the Palm Valley Country Club, Diana and James's relationship blossomed like spring flowers. The age gap that everyone else seemed so concerned about melted away in their private moments. Diana felt herself becoming more youthful with each passing day, while James played the role of the mature, understanding partner perfectly. "Mom, are you sure about this?" Diana's son called from Seattle, his voice heavy with concern. "You barely know him." Diana sat in her sunny kitchen, stirring her morning tea, remembering how James had surprised her just yesterday with her favorite pastries from the French bakery downtown. "Darling, I've been alone for 3 years," she replied, touching the fresh flowers James had brought her. "When you reach my age, you realize that life is too short to worry about what others think." She didn't mention how James made her feel alive again, how he listened to her stories with genuine interest, or how his smile made her heart flutter like she was a teenager. The country club became their stage, where James performed his part flawlessly. He'd hold doors open, pull out chairs, and always seemed to anticipate her needs. The other members watched as Diana transformed from a quiet widow into a vibrant woman who laughed freely and wore brighter colors. "You've brought back my sparkle," she told him one evening as they walked through her garden. James squeezed her hand, pushing away thoughts of his latest threatening message from the loan shark. The weight of his deception felt heavier each day, especially when she looked at him with such trust in her eyes. Their dates were thoughtfully planned. James researched her favorite composers for their evening at the symphony, studied wine to impress her at dinner parties, and learned about art to discuss her collection. He was building a persona of the perfect partner, while carefully avoiding any mentions of his financial troubles. Mrs. Chen, Diana's closest friend, watched their relationship unfold with growing unease. "Diana, honey," she said during their weekly lunch, "don't you find it strange that he never talks about his future plans, his ambitions?" But Diana was too enchanted to hear the concern in her friend's voice. The proposal came on a warm evening in Diana's garden. James had arranged everything perfectly, soft music playing from hidden speakers, candles flickering in the gentle breeze, and her favorite flowers everywhere. He'd spent his last savings on a modest ring, claiming it belonged to his grandmother. "It's been in my family for generations," he said, kneeling before her. The ring wasn't nearly as impressive as the ones Diana usually wore, but she cried when he slipped it on her finger. The story about it being a family heirloom touched her heart more than any expensive piece ever could. The news of their engagement spread through the club like wildfire. The younger trainers exchanged knowing looks, while the elderly members clucked their tongues in disapproval. But Diana was floating on cloud nine, too happy to notice the concerned glances and whispered conversations that followed them. Her children's reaction was exactly what James had expected. Her daughter flew in from Chicago the next weekend, her face tight with worry. "Mom, please tell me you're not serious," she pleaded. "He's younger than I am." Her son threatened to hire a private investigator, but Diana stood firm. "I'm not a child," she told them over dinner at her favorite restaurant. "I know what I'm doing." James sat beside her, playing the role of the understanding fiancé perfectly, even as her children barely concealed their hostility. Inside, he was calculating how soon he could start accessing her accounts after the wedding. The wedding plans moved quickly, too quickly for Diana's children's comfort. James suggested a small, intimate ceremony, knowing that fewer guests meant fewer questions. Diana agreed, touched by his apparent desire for a private, meaningful celebration rather than a showy event. Only a handful of people attended the ceremony in Diana's garden. Her children came, their faces stiff with disapproval. Mrs. Chen was there, watching James carefully throughout the ceremony. A few club members attended, more out of curiosity than celebration. James had no family present, explaining that his mother was too ill to travel, another carefully crafted lie. Diana looked radiant in a cream-colored designer suit, her silver hair elegantly styled, her face glowing with happiness. James stood tall in his new tuxedo, looking every bit the successful young man she believed him to be. As they exchanged vows, he pushed away the guilt that threatened to surface. The small reception that followed was elegant but subdued. Diana's daughter barely touched her champagne, watching as her mother danced with her new husband. Mrs. Chen cornered James by the cake table, her eyes sharp. "You better be good to her," she said quietly, her tone carrying a warning that made him uncomfortable. Later that night, as Diana slept peacefully beside him in their honeymoon suite, James stared at the ceiling, thinking about his next steps. The ring on his finger felt heavy with the weight of his deception. But he was in too deep now. There was no turning back. Besides, he told himself, Diana was happy. Wasn't that worth something? What James didn't know was that his perfect plan was about to face unexpected complications. Sometimes, the most carefully woven webs of deception can unravel from a single loose thread, and someone had already started pulling. Life in the mansion changed quickly after the honeymoon. James moved his few belongings into Diana's spacious walk-in closet, his modest wardrobe looking out of place next to her designer clothes. But that would soon change, he thought, as he began implementing the next phase of his plan. It started with small suggestions. "Darling," he said one morning over breakfast, watching Diana solve her daily crossword puzzle, "don't you think the house needs some updating?" He pointed out how the kitchen appliances were showing their age, how the master bathroom could use a modern touch. Diana, eager to please her young husband, agreed to every suggestion. The renovations began, and with them came the first financial discussions. "It would be easier if I could handle the contractors," James offered, his tone casual. "You shouldn't have to worry about all these details." Diana hesitated for just a moment before adding him to her house renovation account. After all, he was her husband now. James played his role perfectly. He kept Diana busy with shopping trips and social events while he slowly began taking control of their financial matters. "It's just practical," he explained when suggesting she add him to more accounts. "What if something happened to you? I need to be able to take care of things." The country club became less comfortable for Diana. She noticed the looks, the way conversations stopped when she approached. Her old friends made excuses to cancel their regular lunch dates. Only Mrs. Chen still met her every Thursday, though her eyes held questions she was too polite to ask. "The house is really coming together," James would say, showing Diana the progress on the renovations. She smiled and nodded, though sometimes she missed her old, familiar spaces. The construction crews seemed to work endlessly, and the bills kept mounting, but James assured her it was all necessary. One evening, while reviewing some papers, Diana noticed unusual transfers from their joint accounts. "Just investments," James explained smoothly, pulling out a complicated chart he prepared. "I'm diversifying our portfolio." The words were foreign to her, and she felt embarrassed to admit she didn't understand. She signed where he pointed, trusting him completely. Her children called less frequently now. When they did, the conversations were strained. "Mom, are you sure about all these changes?" her daughter asked during one of her rare visits. "You've always been so careful with money." Diana defended James, but a tiny seed of doubt took root in her mind. James noticed her unease and stepped up his attention. He brought her breakfast in bed, planned romantic dinners, and listened to her stories with seemingly endless patience. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me," he would say, kissing her forehead. The guilt that once bothered him had faded, replaced by calculating confidence. The mansion's transformation continued. Modern furniture replaced Diana's beloved antiques, which James claimed were too valuable to keep in daily use. They would be safer in storage, he insisted. Diana watched her family heirlooms disappear one by one, each time feeling a little more lost in her own home. During their evening walks in the garden, the only part of the property that remained unchanged, Diana sometimes felt a strange loneliness, even with James by her side. He was always on his phone now, talking about business opportunities and investment meetings. The quiet moments they used to share had become rare. Mrs. Chen noticed the changes in her friend. Diana's usual elegance seemed dimmed somehow, her confident smile replaced by a nervous one. "Are you happy, dear?" she asked during one of their lunch dates. Diana's answer came too quickly, too brightly. "Of course. Everything's perfect." But everything wasn't perfect. Late one night, Diana woke up to get some water and found James in the study, hunched over her financial documents. He quickly put them away when he saw her, but something in his expression made her stomach tighten. "Just reviewing our portfolio," he said with his usual charming smile. She nodded and returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, her financial advisor called. "Mrs. Richardson, I've been trying to reach you. There are some unusual activities in your accounts that we need to discuss." James intercepted the call, smooth as ever. "I'll handle this, darling. You don't need to worry about these boring details." But Diana was starting to worry. The renovation costs seemed endless, and James's investment opportunities were becoming more frequent. Her once substantial checking account was dwindling, and she found herself having to ask James for money, her own money, for simple purchases. The breaking point came when she discovered her mother's jewelry was missing from the safe. "I moved it to a safety deposit box," James explained, but wouldn't tell her which bank. That night, as she watched him sleep, Diana realized how much control she had given up, piece by piece, decision by decision. What she didn't know was that James's plan was moving faster than expected. The threatening messages from his old creditors had stopped, paid off with her money, but new pressures were building. He needed to move quickly now, before anyone started asking too many questions. But in his rush, he was about to make a crucial mistake. The first crack in Diana's perfect world appeared on a quiet Tuesday evening. She was walking past James's home office when she heard his voice, unusually soft and intimate. The door was slightly open, and against her better judgment, she paused to listen. "Baby, just give me a little more time," James whispered into his phone. "Everything's going according to plan. A few more months, and we'll have everything we need." There was a pause, then a low laugh that Diana had never heard before. "Trust me, she doesn't suspect a thing." Diana's heart pounded as she backed away from the door. Her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped her evening tea. When James came to bed later, she pretended to be asleep, her mind racing with questions she was afraid to ask. The next morning, she tried to act normal during breakfast, but everything felt different. She watched James scroll through his phone, wondering who was on the other end of that call. When she asked about his plans for the day, his answer about investment meetings certainly seemed hollow. "Who's Lisa?" she finally asked, trying to keep her voice steady. James looked up from his coffee, his face perfectly composed. "My cousin," he replied smoothly. "She's having some family troubles, and I've been helping her out." The explanation was perfect, rehearsed even, but Diana noticed he wouldn't meet her eyes. That afternoon, during her weekly lunch with Mrs. Chen, Diana couldn't focus on their usual conversation. Her friend noticed something was wrong. "You've been stirring that soup for 10 minutes, Mrs. Chen observed. "What's bothering you?" Diana wanted to share her concerns, but saying them out loud seemed to make them more real. Instead, she asked, "How did you know when your first husband was lying to you?" Mrs. Chen put down her fork, her eyes sharp with understanding. Back home, Diana started paying attention to details she'd been ignoring. The renovation crews worked sporadic hours, but the bills were enormous. James's business meetings always seemed to happen when she had her regular appointments. And somehow, she couldn't access several of her accounts without his approval. One evening, she tried logging into her main investment account, only to find the password had been changed. When she called the bank, they told her all account changes had to go through her husband, as per her own written instructions she didn't remember giving. The next day, she drove past one of the restaurants where James claimed to have business meetings. The place had been closed for renovations for months. Another lie. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. That night, she pretended to take her sleeping pills, the ones James had recently insisted she needed, but stayed awake. Around midnight, she heard him leaving the bedroom. Following quietly, she found him in the study again, speaking softly on the phone. "The old lady's getting suspicious," she heard him say. "We might need to move faster." Diana's heart nearly stopped. There was a pause, then James laughed. "Don't worry about her kids. They barely talk to her anymore, thanks to me." Diana retreated to her bedroom, her mind spinning. The charming man she'd married, the one who'd made her feel young and alive again, was a stranger. Every sweet word, every gentle touch, every moment they'd shared, had it all been a lie? The next morning, she started her own investigation. She called her old financial advisor from her friend's phone, discovered accounts she didn't know existed, and transfers she'd never approved. Her signature had been forged on multiple documents. She found receipts for jewelry she'd never seen, expensive pieces bought with her money. A quick search on her iPad revealed a dating profile James had forgotten to delete, full of messages to younger women. Each discovery felt like a knife in her heart. Mrs. Chen helped her piece things together. "Remember that young receptionist who quit suddenly?" she asked Diana. "She told me James had been flirting with her, making her uncomfortable. I should have said something sooner." Diana's daughter had been right all along. She thought about all the family gatherings James had helped her avoid, the friends he'd suggested she distance herself from, the way he'd slowly isolated her in her own home. The final piece fell into place when Diana overheard another late-night phone call. This time, she recorded it on her phone, something her grandchildren had taught her to do. James was talking about offshore accounts, about moving money where no one could trace it. "Just a few more transfers," he was saying, "and we'll have enough to disappear completely. She'll never know what hit her until it's too late." The voice that responded was female, young, clearly not a cousin. That night, Diana lay awake, tears sliding silently down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear, they were tears of anger. The man sleeping peacefully beside her had underestimated her. He thought she was just a foolish old woman, easily manipulated and controlled. But Diana Richardson hadn't built and maintained her late husband's empire by being naive. As she watched James sleep, a plan began forming in her mind. He wasn't the only one who could play a long game, and she had something he didn't: decades of experience and connections he knew nothing about. Diana sat in her favorite chair in the garden, watching the sunset while sipping her evening tea. On the surface, everything looked normal, but inside, she was at war with herself. Should she confront James immediately, or wait and gather more evidence? Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. The private investigator's report lay hidden in her garden shed, wrapped in old gardening magazines. She'd hired him through Mrs. Chen's son, making sure to leave no trail back to herself. What the investigator had uncovered made her blood run cold. James wasn't just an opportunistic gold digger, he was a professional con man. There had been other wealthy women before her, each one carefully chosen, each one stripped of their assets before he disappeared. He'd even changed his name multiple times. The charming personal trainer she'd fallen in love with was nothing but a carefully crafted illusion. "Is everything all right, darling?" James appeared on the patio, his smile as perfect as ever. Diana forced herself to smile back, remembering how that same smile used to make her heart flutter. Now it made her stomach turn. "Just enjoying the evening," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. That night, she couldn't sleep. The investigator had found James's girlfriend, a young woman named Lisa who lived in a luxury apartment downtown, paid for with Diana's money. They had been together for years, planning and executing these schemes together. The thought of them laughing at her naivety made her hands clench into fists. The next morning, Diana started making calls from her friend's house, using Mrs. Chen's phone. Her old lawyer was surprised but happy to hear from her. Her bank manager expressed concern about the recent unusual activities in her accounts. Her daughter cried with relief when Diana finally admitted something was wrong. "We need to be careful," her lawyer warned. "Men like this can be dangerous when cornered." Diana thought about the way James had slowly isolated her from her family and friends, how he'd taken control of her life piece by piece. Yes, he was dangerous, but not in the way her lawyer meant. The evidence mounted day by day. The investigator discovered offshore accounts in James's real name. The renovation costs that had seemed so high, most of that money had been diverted to these secret accounts. The missing jewelry had been sold, the profits hidden away. Diana maintained her routine, playing the role of the devoted wife while secretly working to untangle the web James had woven. She took her usual walks, attended her club meetings, and smiled at his stories about business meetings that she now knew were lies. James grew more confident, thinking his plan was working perfectly. He didn't notice how Diana's eyes followed him when he checked his phone, or how she paid attention to every detail of his schedule. He had underestimated her, assuming that her age made her helpless, easy to manipulate. One afternoon, while James was at the gym, Diana received an urgent call from her bank. A large transfer had been attempted, nearly $500,000. She had minutes to decide what to do. "Let it go through," she said finally, "but track every penny." It was time to see just how far James would go. The investigators' photos showed James meeting Lisa at expensive restaurants, planning their future with Diana's money. In one photo, they were laughing, champagne glasses raised in celebration. Diana pinned these photos to a board in her private study, each one fueling her determination. Mrs. Chen helped her gather more evidence. The club's security cameras had caught James in several compromising situations, including heated arguments on his phone in the parking lot. The club's accountant discovered discrepancies in the renovation invoices James had submitted. Diana's children wanted to confront James immediately, but she held them back. "We need to be smarter than him," she told them. "He's played this game before, but he's never gone up against someone like me." The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. The young receptionist who had quit the club came forward with screenshots of inappropriate messages from James. She had been scared to speak up earlier, but seeing Diana's quiet strength gave her courage. James, meanwhile, was getting ready to implement the final phase of his plan. Diana overheard him making arrangements for a business trip abroad, a trip he didn't plan to return from. He had already started moving larger sums of money, confident that she wouldn't notice. What he didn't know was that Diana had already frozen most of their joint accounts. The transfers he thought were going through were actually being tracked and documented. Every move he made added another piece to the evidence being gathered against him. Late one night, Diana found him in the study, frantically trying to access accounts that no longer responded to his passwords. She watched from the doorway as he cursed under his breath, his perfect facade cracking for the first time. The next morning, Diana met with her lawyer, her children, and the investigator. The evidence was overwhelming: bank statements, forged documents, surveillance photos, recorded conversations. Everything was ready. Now she just had to wait for the right moment to spring the trap. That moment would come sooner than expected. James had planned a dinner party for the following weekend, intending to announce a new investment opportunity to Diana's wealthy friends. Little did he know, it would be his last performance as the devoted husband. Diana looked at herself in the mirror, touching up her makeup with steady hands. The foolish, love-struck widow was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned her lesson the hard way, but who was about to teach one of her own. The evening of the dinner party arrived on a perfect autumn night. Diana had spent the day preparing, but not in the way James expected. While he thought she was getting the house ready for his big investment announcement, she was putting the final pieces of her plan into place. The dining room sparkled with candlelight, fine china, and crystal glasses. James had invited several of Diana's wealthy friends, planning to charm them into his newest scheme. He adjusted his expensive tie, bought with Diana's money, and smiled at his reflection, unaware that this would be his last performance. "Everything looks perfect," Diana said, watching him preen. She was wearing her favorite blue dress and a string of pearls that had belonged to her mother. James kissed her cheek, not noticing the slight stiffness in her posture. "You look beautiful, darling," he said, checking his phone one last time. The guests began arriving at 7. Mrs. Chen came first, giving Diana a supple nod. Then came the others, longtime friends from the country club, business associates of Diana's late husband, all carefully chosen. James worked the room like a professional, turning on the charm that had fooled so many before. Dinner was served at 8. The conversation flowed along with the wine, and James kept glancing at his watch, waiting for the perfect moment to make his announcement. Diana watched him from the head of the table, thinking about all the lies, all the manipulation, all the stolen moments of trust. "Everyone," James stood up, tapping his glass with a spoon. "I have an exciting opportunity to share with you all." He smiled his perfect smile, the one that had once made Diana's heart skip a beat. "An investment that could double your money in just 6 months." "Before you continue," Diana interrupted, her voice calm but firm, "I have an announcement of my own." She nodded to Mrs. Chen, who quietly slipped out of the room. James's smile faltered slightly, but he kept his composure. The dining room doors opened again. In walked Diana's children, her lawyer, and 2 police detectives. James's face went pale, but he tried to maintain control. "What's going on, darling?" he asked, his voice only slightly strained. Diana stood, her hands steady as she placed a thick folder on the table. "Let me tell you about a different kind of investment," she said, looking directly at James. "One where a con man marries wealthy women, steals their money, and disappears." The room went silent. James started to speak, but Diana held up her hand. "Don't bother denying it. We have everything. The offshore accounts, the forged documents, the recordings of your phone calls with Lisa." At the mention of Lisa's name, James's perfect mask finally cracked. One by one, Diana laid out the evidence. The bank statements showing millions in diverted funds. The photos of James with Lisa. The testimonies from his previous victims. With each revelation, James seemed to shrink, his confidence evaporating like morning dew. "Did you really think I was just a foolish old woman?" Diana asked, her voice strong. "Did you forget that I helped build my late husband's business? That I've dealt with people trying to con me for decades?" The police moved forward as James made a desperate dash for the door. But Diana's gardener, a former security professional she'd hired months ago, was waiting outside. The arrest was quick and quiet, exactly as Diana had planned. As the police led James away, he looked back at Diana with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. She met his gaze steadily, remembering how those eyes had once made her believe in love again. "The performance is over," she said softly. The dinner party guests were stunned, but also impressed. Many of them had doubted James from the start, but hadn't known how to tell Diana. Now they watched with admiration as she handled the situation with grace and strength. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Diana sat in her garden with Mrs. Chen. "I feel like such a fool," she admitted, finally letting her guard down. Her friend took her hand. "No, you're one of the smartest people I know." You turned his game around on him. In the weeks that followed, Diana worked with the authorities to help track down James's other victims. She discovered she wasn't his first target, but she would be his last. The evidence she had gathered was overwhelming, ensuring he would face serious consequences for his actions. She also started a support group for other women who had been targeted by romance scams. Her story, shared carefully and thoughtfully, helped others recognize the warning signs she had missed. "It's not about age or loneliness," she would tell them. "These predators are professionals, but they're not invincible." The country club became a place of healing for Diana. The whispers and judgment were replaced with respect and admiration. Younger members sought her advice, not just about finance, but about life and love. She had turned her pain into wisdom, her embarrassment into strength. 1 year later, Diana stood in her garden, which was blooming more beautifully than ever. She had repaired her relationships with her children, strengthened her friendships, and reclaimed her independence. The renovations James had started were finally complete, but this time they reflected her taste, her choices. "Will you ever trust again?" her daughter asked during a Sunday brunch. Diana smiled, touching her mother's pearls. "Trust isn't about never being fooled," she said. "It's about being strong enough to survive when you are. And I'm stronger than ever."